Welcome back to Elevate Chem. I'm Jesse and this is another concept video. This episode is all about redox. Certainly can be one of the more challenging topics throughout chemistry, and to explore this concept we're going to be looking at a question because ultimately the best way to learn a concept is by tackling how it's applied in an actual exam. Now this is the first episode in our 5-part series, and as always the first thing I want you to do is have a tackle at this question. This is from the Waite 2013 paper. I want you to download it and have a crack at question 41, only up to the end of part C, and then I'll see you back here once you're done. So pause the video and have a go. Fantastic. Now I understand that you guys might not have necessarily come across a lead and lead oxide battery, and that's what this is looking at. It's often called a lead acid battery. And lead, just in case you didn't know, has the chemical symbol Pb. So let's jump right into the question. The overall battery reaction during discharge is given below. Write and balance the anode and cathode reactions for the lead acid storage battery. Now again, as always, it's possible that you might have just memorized what a lead acid battery is and what are the reactions that are taking place at the anode and cathode respectively. But I really want to focus on the understanding, and in this case I want to focus on the logic of actually using other bits of information that's given to us in order to help answer this question. Now, if we have a look, we're given the overall reaction here, and we're going to use that to our advantage. I'm also going to pair that with another bit of information that we're given just up here, and that's that lead is the reducing agent, while lead oxide, PbO2, is the oxidizing agent. Now, as we know from redox, if lead is the reducing agent, that means it undergoes oxidation. It's one of those weird little things about, and whoever decided the wording, not very pleased with them. But if something is the reducing agent, that means it's undergoing oxidation. And oxidation, of course, occurs at the anode. And you can remember that from either red cat and ox, or whatever method you want to memorize it. And hopefully after you do enough practice papers, it'll become second nature. So at the anode, we know there's oxidation occurring, and we know that lead must be oxidized as it is the reducing agent. So I'm going to put lead on the left-hand side of my equation, and of course, it should be a solid. And we know that's being oxidized. Now, that of course means that my lead oxide is being reduced, and reduction happens at the cathode. So that means I'm going to put my lead oxide on the left-hand side of my cathode reaction. Now I'm going to have to work out a bunch of other things to ensure that I understand what's happening here. And we need to sort of fill in the gaps here. And if we notice from the overall reaction that we've still got another couple elements that we're going to have to place on either side of the equation. We've got some hydrogen ions, which are unaccounted for, some sulfate ions, which are unaccounted for, and then we've got the ultimate product of some lead sulfate and some water. So ultimately, we're going to need some lead sulfate, and we're going to need some water on the right-hand side, and we're still waiting to introduce some hydrogen ions and some sulfate ions on the left. Now, if we look at this anode reaction, we understand that it must be oxidation occurring, and that means the oxidation of lead must be increasing. Now, considering that we've got sulfate ions here, a really easy way to oxidize lead is to actually add some of those sulfate ions to the solid lead. And we notice down here that it's given as aqueous, so I'm going to continue that trend up here. And is this enough for an oxidation reaction? Yes, it is. So now all I need to do is write the products on the right-hand side. And that would be my lead sulfate, and that'll be a solid. And well, what's going to be left over? Well, I need to ensure, as always, that just like any math sort of equation, these chemical equations need to be balanced as well. On the left-hand side, I've got an overall charge of 2 minus, so that means on the right-hand side, I'm going to add in 2 electrons to make the overall charge on the right-hand side also 2 minus. Now, of course, to produce my overall reaction, I'm going to be adding these two reactions here together. And in the final reaction, notice that there's actually no electrons at all. And that means that these reactions are going to have to balance out, and on the left-hand side of this reaction, I'm going to add in those electrons so they will eventually cancel out. But of course, don't write that strike through when you're actually answering the exam. I'm just doing that here for illustrative purposes. Now, when it comes to reduction occurring at the cathode, we also know that on the right-hand side of the equation is some water, as we haven't actually used that yet. So I'm just going to add that on the right-hand side straight away. Now, if you notice here, I'm not necessarily going for understanding the lead-acid battery itself. I'm simply using deduction from some of the information given. Additionally, not only is there water on the right-hand side of this equation, but there's actually 2 lead sulfates. So I'm going to add that second lead sulfate on the right-hand side, and now we have our 2 lead sulfates as required. Now all I need to do is work out what other things I need on the left-hand side of this cathode reaction to ensure that it all balances. One thing that I'm certainly missing is, once again, this sulfate. I'm going to add it in as an ion, as I did for my previous reaction. And now I've got both of these sulfate ions added. Finally, the last thing that I'm missing is these 4 hydrogen ions, so I'm going to add them in as well, and of course, they should be aqueous. So notice that I've actually answered this question without knowing anything at all about a lead-acid battery. All I did was use the content that was given to me in the question, and this should be a really common theme. Because of my understanding of the fact that a reducing agent is oxidized and an oxidizing agent is reduced, and the fact that reduction takes place at the cathode and oxidation takes place at the anode, I combined that with this overall reaction, and that was actually able to help me to answer the question without knowing anything about the lead-acid battery itself. So this entire process, guys, boiled down to a couple of things. Remembering that the reducing agent is oxidized, and vice versa, and of course remembering that oxidation occurs at the anode. The last bit of information I used was just using the overall reaction and balancing the equations. Fantastic. Now it's asking you to draw a schematic diagram of the lead-acid battery. And certainly if you got to this stage of the question without knowing what a lead-acid battery was, you might have been stumped a little bit. But once again, let's use this information that we've been provided, and let's see if we can work it out. The first thing is we've got a lead and we've got a lead oxide electrode. So I'm going to include both of those. Now it says we need to label the anode and cathode, and thankfully we know from this equation up here, or from the information provided in the question, which way around it is. If Pb is the reducing agent, it's being oxidized, and this occurs at the anode. This means this electrode right here is the anode, and because of that, this one must be the cathode. Fantastic. So I'm going to cross off both of those. And now I need to indicate the salt bridge. Now you could certainly get stumped a bit at this point and be like, well, where is my salt bridge? The salt bridge is actually these sulfate ions. And if I have sulfate ions and I'm talking about an acid, hopefully the thing that pops into your head straight away is, okay, that means I've actually got a solution as my salt bridge, and my solution is actually sulfuric acid. And this will, of course, dissociate into both hydrogen ions and my sulfate ions. I'm going to put all of this in some sort of vessel, indicate that there's some sort of liquid present, and there's my salt bridge. It's actually this solution of sulfuric acid. Now the last bit of the question is to indicate the direction of electron flow. So I'm going to include some wires to connect these electrodes. And my electrons are negatively charged. And negatively charged things are going to be attracted to positively charged things. And remember, these electrons run along the wire. So my cathode is positively charged, my anode is negatively charged, and my electrons, whilst running along this wire here, are going to want to head towards the positive electrode. So that means my electrons are going in this direction here. So they're coming out from the anode and entering the cathode. And in fact, you can actually see that from the equation we've written up here. The anode produces our electrons, whilst the cathode actually uses up those electrons. So there's me indicating the direction of electron flow. Fantastic. Now in part C, we've got 2 parts to it. With reference to the electrical potential of a galvanic cell, describe how the lead acid storage battery produces current. I thought this was a little bit of a challenging question just in the way it was worded, and instead I just went for what is producing current here. Now ultimately the thing that is causing current is actually the flow of ions itself. When these ions flow, these force the electrons to want to move around by causing these positive and negative charges. But ultimately, well, why are those ions flowing? Well, the reason why is because there's an electrical potential. If you had the standard potentials of both lead and lead oxide in front of you, you'd see that there's an electric potential for what is essentially a galvanic cell. And this means it's a favored reaction. It's going to want to proceed, and that's causing these sulfate ions to move, and ultimately these electrons to move, which is also known as current. So what I would write down is that I write down that the electrical potential is caused by differences in standard potential This causes movement of sulfate ions, which causes the flow of electrons producing current. So the key takeaway here, guys, is in case you didn't know, current is moving electrons. And moving electrons in this case has to be associated with those moving ions. And then you get sort of into the deep sort of philosophical questions of why are those ions moving? Well, that's because there's a difference in standard potential between those two electrodes. So ultimately, that's the root cause of this current. And another terminology for the difference in standard potential is the electrical potential. Finally, what determines the magnitude of the electrical potential of a cell? The difference in standard potential. And if you want to go one level deeper than that, what causes the difference in standard potential? Then you'd be starting to look at the difference in electronegativity as well as some other more advanced things. Fantastic, guys. So some of the key takeaway messages from this question was we want to obtain the half reactions from an overall reaction. It's not commonly done. Often we actually go in the forward of getting both half reactions and combining them, but it's super useful to be able to do them in the verse. Secondly, it's really important about how you actually draw these diagrams. Things you should definitely do is include labeling the things it tells you to label and making sure that your writing is nice and clear. And finally, when it comes to electrical potential, it's all about the flow of electrons and the differences in standard potential. Fantastic. I hope that helped you out, guys, with this very challenging topic of redox. I'll see you in the next episode.